Palcha. Hello and welcome to Keith's Whisky Vlog. My name is Keith, and as well as here on YouTube you'll find me on Instagram at Whisky Tour Guide Keith, all one word. Now in this video it's a little bit of a tutorial. What I'm going to do is talk to you about the whisky regions in Scotland. On every bottle of whisky it will tell you which region it was made, and that will give you a clue as to the nature, the character of the whisky in the bottle. So before you taste it, there are clues on the label. Now depending on who you listen to, there's a little bit of dispute as to how many whisky regions we have. For a long time there were 4, there might be 5, there's probably 5, there may even be 6, but we'll see. I'll talk you through each of them. At the moment, as I speak, this is 2021, the year 2021, and there are about 130 distilleries in Scotland that make grain whisky, malt whisky, some for blends, some for single malts, some for both. In the last sort of decade, from the 2010s up to 2020, in that decade there were more distilleries opened in Scotland, new distilleries, than in any decade since the 1800s. Demand for whisky worldwide is massive, and quite simply in Scotland we cannot make whisky quick enough to meet the demand. So you've got a lot of these new distilleries opening. You've got a lot of old distilleries being recommissioned, reopening as well. So look out for some of those, some real sort of venerable names from Scottish whisky history. Now, to be a region, you have to have at least 3 working distilleries producing whisky, and that's why there's a little bit of ambiguity as to how many actual regions there are. There's 4 definite regions, so I'll go through them first of all, then I'll tell you about the 5th region, and then I'll talk about the 6th region that isn't really a region, I suppose. Now, I'll turn around to my trusty map. I have my Whisky Tour Guide Keith pointer. The first region I'm going to talk about is in the south of Scotland, down here, and this is the Lowland region, and it more or less corresponds with the geographical area that we call the Lowlands. The Lowlands of Scotland are below the line here, down here. The Lowland whisky region doesn't quite go that high. It only really comes up to about here, the Firth of Tay. So this area, Fife, across towards Glasgow, and anywhere south of there, east and west, is the Lowland whisky region. You've got distilleries in Fife. You've got likes of Lindores Abbey, and you've got King's Barns. You come down near Edinburgh, you have Glenkinchie, and down into the borders you've got the Annandale distillery. A bit further along is Bladnoch. Come up the west coast past Ailsa Bay, and in Glasgow you've got likes of Auchentoshan. So there's some of the Lowland distilleries. Lowland whiskies tend to be quite, I would say, quite light, quite gentle, quite smooth. The sort of flavour notes are maybe a bit creamy, a little bit honey, that sort of flavour note, and they're renowned as being quite grassy as well, maybe like hay, cut grass, hay, that sort of cereal. You can sort of get the malt coming through quite a lot in your Lowland whiskies. In the past, the Lowlands for producing whisky have been associated a bit more with grain whisky and with blends. Now if you want to know more about these terms, I'll also do a tutorial for you on sort of whisky terms, whisky words, whisky jargon, that sort of thing, if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about. So the Lowland region is the first region, and it's at the light end of the scale, the gentle. It's maybe for the more discerning palate. Maybe pre-dinner drinks, have a Lowland dram. The second region I'm going to talk about is up here. There are 4 big rivers in Scotland. You've got the Tay, which is the biggest, this one here, comes into the sea here. The Tweed down in the borders, along here, goes into the sea at Berwick. Up in the northeast you have the River Dee, goes into the sea at Aberdeen. And the 4th big river is this valley here, and it's the River Spey, S-P-E-Y. And on Speyside, this is where about half of Scotland's distilleries are. It's our most concentrated whisky producing region. Now you've got the main population centres down here. The government, the crown, the taxman. As you go up into the Highlands, you've got a big range of mountains, and Speyside is north of there. There's a lot of rich farmland. They can grow their barley. There's loads of fresh water, and they're away from that sort of central interference. So for a long time they've been making whisky on a grand scale on Speyside. Some of the big hitters, the biggest producers of single malt whisky, you've got Macallan, you've got Glenfiddich, Glenlivet. Between them, they produce more single malt whisky than anyone else. So real big producers. Other smaller distillers up there, you've got distilleries like Glenfarclas, which is a personal favourite, places like Aberlour, Ben Romach. These are all on Speyside as well. So lots and lots of distilleries on Speyside, very concentrated region. And the flavour notes on Speyside, you get a little bit more of the sort of the wood from the barrel, so that sort of oak, the tannins, a little bit of sort of caramel, a little bit of fruity as well on Speyside. You're talking things like apples and pears, you get a little bit of that, and maybe just a little bit of spice. So you've got that, the sort of the vanilla, the wood, the oak, and that fruit coming through on your Speyside. They're quite classic Scottish whiskies, I think. If you're looking to try and have your first ever Scottish whisky, I usually recommend a Glenlivet 12-year-old right in the middle, and that pretty much, you can then decide which way to go. So Lowland, nice and light, Speyside in the middle, covering quite a wide range in the middle of the flavour spectrum. Now we go off the west coast now, we're going down to the southwest of Scotland. This island here, and this is a special place for me. This is where my favourite whiskies come from. There are 9 distilleries on this island. This is of course the island of Islay, and it is classed as its own special whisky region. I'm going to go through the 9 distilleries on Islay, since there are only 9. There's one new one that's not quite producing whisky yet because it's not quite 3 years old, and that's Ardnahoe. But you also have Bunnahabhain, Killila, Kilchoman, Bruichladdich, Bowmore, Ardbeg, Lagavulin and Laphroaig. Hopefully that's the 9. So the population on Islay is maybe about 3,200, 3,300, quite a small population, 9 distilleries. You've got all this whisky knowledge, all the expertise. You can smell the whisky in the air. And Islay whiskies are the teenagers, the noisy, the louts, if you like, of Scotch whisky. If you take the lid off a bottle of Islay single malt, the whole room smells of it straight away, and that is because they're very pungent and aromatic, very smoky and earthy. When you're making whisky, you use barley, so you malt the barley, and that basically, you spread it on the floor, you make it wet, the starches convert into sugars, and that sugar is maltose. So that's the malting process. You malt the barley. Now a lot of places might use, you've got to stop that process, so you dry out the barley, and a lot of places have used coal, or they've used wood, or central heating, whatever. On Islay, the main fuel source is peat, and this is a real earthy fuel that basically you dig out the ground. It's very earthy, and when you burn that, it infuses that peat smoke, that earthiness, into the barley, into the ingredients, into the process. So Islay whisky, I've got one up here. This is the Laphroaig. This is a real notorious, smelly, smoky Islay whisky. Now there are exceptions. Bunnahabhain tend not to put peat smoke into their whisky, but in the main, Islay whiskies at the louder, noisier end of the scale. So you've got Lowland, nice and gentle, Speyside cover in the middle, and Islay at the real sort of pungent, aromatic end of the tasting scale. So that's 3 regions: Lowland, Speyside, Islay. Lowland down here, Speyside here, Islay over here. The 4th traditional region in Scotland is basically everywhere else, and that is classed as Highland. So Lowland, Speyside, Islay, Highland. And this covers the islands, covers just north of the lowlands. On the west coast you have Oban. Where's Oban gone? Oban here is a highland. Up in the east you've got the village of Aberfeldy, you've got the Dewars distillery at Aberfeldy. A bit further north you've got Dalwhinnie, right up in the mountains, about as far inland as you can get in Scotland. And when you go away up to the the northern part. You've got places like Glenmorangie, you've got, or Glenmorangie, who knows how to pronounce it, Clynelish, you've got Pulteney. So those are Highland distilleries, and because there's such a diversity of Highland distilleries, there's a real diversity of flavour, really. A bit maybe heathery, you've got that, a bit fruity, maybe some coastal notes. Over, for instance, on the Isle of Skye, you've got the Talisker distillery, very well known. That's a Highland distillery, but they're quite lightly smoky whiskies. It's an island, the distillery is right on the shore, and it's got as much in common with the Islay distilleries as it has with some of the Highland distilleries. So Highland is a bit of a hodgepodge, a bit of a mishmash of flavours and styles. It's a bit of a catch-all term. Just if you're not Lowland, Speyside or Islay, you are Highland. That's the 4 main regions. At the start I told you there's 4, 5 or 6 whisky regions. So the 5th region, it's almost like the 5th Beatle, I like to term it as, is down this peninsula down here. Most people will have heard of the famous song from the 1970s, The Mull of Kintyre by Wings. As good as the bagpipes have ever sounded, I think, that tune. So this peninsula is called the Mull of Kintyre, and right down here is a town called Campbelltown. Now there's about 3 or 4 or 5 distilleries in Campbelltown today, so it just about qualifies as a region. At its peak in the 1800s, the late 1800s, I believe there were nearly 30 distilleries down here in Campbelltown, and they supplied a lot of whisky over to America, for instance. But into the early 1900s, first of all you had the First World War, and a lot of the men who went to the First World War, the distillery workers, a lot of them didn't return, and a lot of the distilleries closed down in Campbelltown. And then into the 1920s or the late teens, you've got prohibition in America, and the bottom just completely fell out of the Campbelltown market. So the amount of people or distilleries producing whisky in Campbelltown fell, but with the demand going up this century, some of the old distilleries have been recommissioned. The 2 main ones you have are Springbank and Glen Scotia. You also have Glengyle, Kilkerran, there's 1 or 2 others, sorry for forgetting them, people from Campbelltown, but they're having a little bit of a resurgence. Now Campbelltown whiskies, they're a bit harder to describe. They're quite rich, they're quite robust. The Springbank, the sort of standard age statement, the way that I describe that when you taste it, it's like if you get if you go into the countryside, find a nice little stream, a little burn as we call them in Scotland, find a nice smooth pebble, put it in your mouth and suck it. And that's how I describe the tasting for the Springbank. It's quite stony, quite clear. It's not a bad thing at all, but really quite unique. It's got that sort of freshness to it. So Campbelltown whiskies, the Campbelltown region, you'll see they put Campbelltown on the bottles, so it is effectively, officially, the 5th Scottish whisky region. So Lowland, Highland, Islay, Speyside, Campbelltown. There's your 5 regions. It'll tell you on the bottle where it was made, and that gives you a clue as to the flavour. I also mentioned there might be a 6th region. We're nowhere near having an official 6th region, but if you're in a whisky shop, or maybe if you're flying, you're in duty free, you'll often see an islands label. So not Highland, islands. We have a lot of island distilleries which come under the Highland banner. So again, turn around. If you go up to the Orkney Islands, there are 2 distilleries. Highland Park, I've got a little Highland Park here. So here's my Highland, this is my Islay, Highland, Lowland, a Bladnoch, and I've got a Speyside here, Glen Keith. Great name, brilliantly named whisky. So the Highland Park distillery is up on the Orkney Islands and Scapa. Over on the Skye I mentioned Talisker. Up on Lewis you've got Avanjarrig. You've also got the Harris distillery. They've not quite produced whisky yet, but they're just about. They're quite a new distillery. As you come down, you've got the Isle of Mull. You've got Tobermory, also Ledig as well. They produce, and you've got Arran down here. The Arran distillery is quite highly rated. Also, between Islay and the mainland is the island of Jura. There's a distillery on Jura. So a lot of these island whiskies, which are technically Highland, are often labelled as islands in shops, in duty free, things like that. So one little more thing before I finish up that I'd like to talk about is, I've mentioned the distilleries, the regions. Now you might think that if a distillery is in the aforementioned geographical area, then it would automatically have that geographical appellation. But there are some exceptions. The rules for the regions, what region you put in your bottle, I think it was the 1980s they were sort of formalised, laid down. And a lot of distilleries previously had advertised themselves as something different. Probably the best example is the Macallan Distillery. Now the Macallan Distillery sits on a bend on the River Spey. You've got the Spey down here, got a hill, and there's Macallan Distillery. If it rained hard enough, Macallan would end up in the Spey. But if you get a bottle of Macallan, you look at the region, it says it's a Highland whisky. Now it's a Speyside, but you'll see it says Highland. There's other exceptions as well, again probably relating to Speyside. Now we've got the River Spey Valley right here. The next valley to the west is the River Findhorn Valley, this one here. Now the Benromach Distillery is in the Findhorn Basin, Findhorn catchment area. But if you look at a bottle of Benromach, it says Speyside, so it should really be Highland in my humble opinion. If you come down to here, we've got the Dalwhinnie Distillery, and the Dalwhinnie Distillery is in the Spey Basin, the Spey catchment area. It sits on the River Toom, and for me that should be a Speyside. You look at a bottle of Dalwhinnie, it says Highland. So Benromach in the Highland area says Speyside, Dalwhinnie in the Speyside area, look at the bottle, it says Highland. So there are exceptions to the rule, but it's a good pointer, a good clue, the region as to the flavour profile, what you're going to get in the bottle. I think that's everything I wanted to say on whisky regions. Hopefully that clears things up. Any questions, any comments, obviously feel free to get in touch. Like and subscribe to this channel, or follow me on Instagram at Whisky Tour Guide Keith. Before I go, absolutely essential, what I have to do obviously is pour myself a little whisky. Now I mentioned my favourite whiskies come from, of course, from Islay. The Islay on the shelf is the bad boy of Islay single malts, the Laphroaig 10 years old, so why not? Now when you go into the Laphroaig distillery, just outside on the wall, they've got a lot of feedback, a lot of comments from Laphroaig drinkers, and my favourite one, there's a little tile and it says, "Drinking Laphroaig is like kissing my granny who smoked 40 a day." Now I didn't kiss my granny, don't worry, but it evokes what Laphroaig is like. Very aromatic, very pungent. So on that note, I will leave you to, hopefully you've got a whisky there. So all the best, cheers, and Slanjava.